Good morning to you out there. It's morning here anyway, whatever time it is for you. Thanks for tuning in. Broadcasting from Nebraska City, Nebraska. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for our most recent podcast, the 8th edition of a weekly series to discuss the Lewis and Clark expedition. The podcast is being produced and presented by the good folks at the Missouri River Basin Lewis and Clark Interpretive Trail and Visitor Center in Nebraska City, Nebraska. The focus of the podcast is on the journal entries for the current week so that we can see exactly what the Corps of Discovery is doing in 1804, 1805, and 1806, the years of the expedition as it set out and returned to St. Louis. The language used in the podcast assumes that the listener tuned in to the prior podcast and thus has some background information in mind. You can find us on Facebook by searching MRB Lewis and Clark Center, and check out our website at lewisandclarkvisitorscenter.org. We are located along the Missouri River, along the route of the expedition. We have 3 floors of Lewis and Clark themed exhibits, walking and hiking trails, and a Plains Indian Earth Lodge replica. There are no more surviving 1803 entries until November 11th. September 19th through November 11th, November 10th, are lost. So we'll start at 1804 this week, as we had been able to do 1803 the last couple of weeks. September 19th to September 25th, 1804, the Corps headed north and west a bit, starting the week near modern-day Lower Brule, South Dakota, and ending at Pierre, South Dakota. The Corps spends a couple of days passing quite a few islands and old Indian encampments, making slow time upstream, when at 1:30 a.m. on September 21st, Clark writes, "Half-past 1 o'clock, the sandbar on which we camped began to give way, which alarmed the sergeant on guard, and the noise waked me up. I got up and by the light of the moon observed that the sand was giving away, both above and below, and would swallow our pirogues in a few minutes. I ordered all hands on board and pushed off. We had not got to the opposite shore before part of our camp fell into the river." This entry is certainly one of the most descriptive and powerful ones regarding the shifting nature of the Missouri River, and the point that islands and shorelines can literally be destroyed and disappear with little warning and with great haste. On the 22nd, they see an abandoned trading fort which Regis LaSalle had used to trade with the Teton Sioux. Also, there were lodges and stables for horses. But these were abandoned, and the Corps still had not crossed paths with the Teton Sioux at this point. On the 23rd, it's more islands and more sandbars. Buffalo are spotted, a great number of them, Clark writes. And then he writes this passage. "Soon after we landed, 3 Sioux boys swam across to us. Those boys informed us that a band of Sioux called the Tetons of 80 lodges were camped near the mouth of the next river. 60 lodges more a short distance above them. They had that day set the prairies on fire to let those camps know of our approach. We gave those boys 2 twists of tobacco to carry to their chiefs and warriors to smoke, with directions to tell them that we wish to speak to them tomorrow at the mouth of the next river." Now, on the following day, September 24th, the social intercourse with the Teton does not start out well. As Clark writes, "Coulter ran up the bank and reported that the Sioux had taken his horse." Clark goes on to inform the Teton that we should not speak to them any more until the horse was returned to us again. He ends the entry for the day by saying, "I went on shore and smoked with a chief called Buffalo Medicine, who came to see us here. The chief said he knew nothing of the horse, etc. I informed them we would call the grand chiefs in council tomorrow." The next day, on the 25th, as the council gets underway, again, things do not start off well. Clark writes, we discover our interpreter does not speak the language well. He's probably referring to Pierre Cruzat, who could speak in the tongue of the Omaha language, which was not sufficient here. But nevertheless, the tactical blunder of not having Pierre Dorian come with them further after setting off from the Yankton village is showing itself today. His translating in good standing with the Teton would have been a key addition to this council. What was becoming a typical presentation ensues. Lewis gives a speech, and more medals are handed out to the great chiefs. They were brought on board and shown the curiosities on the ship, to which they were impressed. They were given a half glass of whiskey that they were extremely fond of. That's in Clark's words. The next sentence in his journal, he writes that the chiefs soon began to be troublesome, the second chief affecting drunkenness as a cloak for his villainous intentions, as I found afterwards, reeled or fell off about the boat. I went in a pirogue with those chiefs, who left the boat with great reluctance. My object was to reconcile them and leave them on shore. As soon as I landed, 3 of their young men seized the cable of the pirogue. One soldier hugged the mast, and the second chief was extremely insolent, both in words and gestures to me, declaring I should not go off, saying he had not received payment sufficient from us. I attempted to pacify him, but it had a contrary effect, for his insults became so personal and his intentions evident to do me injury. I drew my sword and ordered all hands under arms. At this moment, Captain Lewis ordered all men in the keel boat to come to arms. The 5 or so men who accompanied Clark in the pirogue also had their arms up. The Grand Chief Black Buffalo grabbed the cable of the boat and motioned his young warriors and secondary chiefs back. There about 100 warriors stood, bows drawn, their distance only about 20 yards from Clark and the pirogue. The white pirogue was sent back to the keel boat. In Clark's words, the pirogue soon returned with about 12 of our determined men ready for any event. Black Buffalo then lets go of the rope, and Clark offers his hand to Black Buffalo, but he refuses. Clark then writes, I proceeded to the pirogue and pushed off, and had not proceeded far before the first and third chief and 2 principal men walked into the water and requested to go on board. I took them in, and we proceeded on about a mile and anchored near a small island. I call this island Bad-Humored Island. Well, the situation was diffused. It really hung in the balance there. The way Clark writes about it, it seems to all happen so quickly. Black Buffalo could have given the order to loose the arrows, his men outnumbering the Corps of Discovery, especially the small detachment on shore led by Clark. It would have ended the expedition. The entire course of history would have been altered. The timeline and expansions into the West would have been irrevocably changed. I felt myself warm, Clark writes, as his sword was drawn. But in that moment, cool heads prevailed. Black Buffalo stood down at his moment of great decision. John Ordway has a couple of quotes in his journal on that day to help illuminate the events. He writes, but they did not appear to talk much until they had got the goods, and then they wanted more, and said we must stop with them, or leave one of the pirogues with them, as that is what they expected. Captain Lewis showed the air gun, shot it several times. He says that after goods were exchanged on the keel boat and the whiskey was consumed, that the captain said it was time for them to continue on, and it was at that moment that the second chief that Clark mentions begins to act drunk. Ordway talks of the situation on the keel boat when the call to arms was issued. He writes, Captain Lewis, who was on board, ordered every man to his arms. The large swivel gun loaded immediately with 16 musket balls in it. The 2 other swivels loaded with buckshot, each of them manned. He says that heated words were exchanged by Black Buffalo and Captain Clark at the moment when the whole situation hung in the balance. He says that Clark tells Black Buffalo that we were not squaws but warriors. The chief said he had warriors too, and if we were to go on, they would follow us and kill and take the whole of us by degree, or that he had another party or lodge above this one, and that they would be able to destroy us. Clark rebuttals him that the whole of America would come after them if Clark and his men were killed at this spot. Clark assures Black Buffalo that they shall camp nearby, and tomorrow the women and children would be allowed to come see the keelboat and the expedition. And it's at this moment that Black Buffalo lets go of the rope, and they camped 1 mile ahead of that. And with this cliffhanger, the week in 1804 ends. As tragedy was avoided today, what will happen tomorrow is still up in the air at this point. Join us next week to learn how the interactions with the Lakota people ends. September 19th to September 25th, 1805, headed west through the Lolo Pass, they end the week near modern-day Orofino, Idaho. On September 19th, they spot a plane about 60 miles distant. Old Toby, their Shoshone guide, informs them that it is the Columbia River plain, and that they shall reach the outskirts by tomorrow. They were low on food. Lewis writes that the sight of the plain revived spirits. He says, Fraser's horse fell from the road in this evening and rolled with his load near 100 yards into the creek. We all expected that the horse was killed, but to our astonishment, when the load was taken off him, he arose to his feet and appeared to be little injured. In 20 minutes he proceeded on with his load. Amazing. They made 18 miles that day and ate portable soup at camp that night. Ordway writes that they ate the last of the provisions and that only a little portable soup remained. On the 20th, they proceed 14 miles. They are reduced to eating a horse. Everyone was happy about that, having meat once again. Lewis describes several new birds to science on this day and one plant. Clark encounters the Nez Perce for the first time, and the first sign of dietary problem shows up shortly thereafter, as Clark writes, I find myself very unwell all the evening from eating the fish and roots too freely. It's quite interesting that Clark realized the digestive problems are immediately due to his new diet. But with little else to eat, on September 21st, still low on food, Lewis and his men dine on the remainder of horse meat, plus some crawfish, pheasant, and a coyote that they had killed during the day. They called the coyote a prairie wolf, and it is the only time they ate it during the expedition. On the same day, Clark encounters a great chief of the Nez Perce fishing, whom he found to be a very cheerful man. Clark's party had stumbled upon a major fishing spot of the Clearwater River. He writes again that he still feels very sick and that vomiting helps. Clark, who was head of the main party by a couple of days, sent back fish and roots for the main party. On the 22nd, the food arrives to Lewis. It is divided and consumed. Clark is still not feeling well, worse in fact, as he writes on this day. John Ordway writes of how sweet the roots tasted. They were all very hungry. They all gorged on salmon and these camas roots. Joseph Whitehouse writes that the camas roots were made into a kind of bread and had a taste similar to that of pumpkin. On September 23rd, Clark writes that his hip hurts, that Lewis and 2 other men are very sick today. John Ordway writes that large quantities of fish and camas roots were purchased from the Nez Perce. Joseph Whitehouse writes a similar passage. Small articles, blue beads in particular, were most desirable as trade goods by the Nez Perce. Also, a couple of flags and some medals were handed out to chiefs. On September 21st, it had gotten worse. Now, as Clark writes, all men are complaining of lax and heaviness in the stomach. Rush's pills were distributed. These were very powerful laxatives of the day. They would camp in the same spot from September 25th to October 6th. Learn why next week. Their salmon and digestive problems are just beginning. September 19th to September 25th, 1806. Headed east near modern-day Jefferson City, Missouri, to St. Louis, Missouri. On September 19th, the excitement is growing. Clark writes, "The men ply their oars and were descended with great velocity. Our anxiety is also the wish of the party to proceed on as expeditiously as possible. We calculate on arriving at the first settlement on tomorrow evening, which is 140 miles. On the 20th, Clark writes that 3 of the 4 men were unable to row because of the condition of their eyes. Sore eyes was a somewhat common affliction by the men of the Corps and the natives of the time. Dr. Rush had sent his eye wash with them to cleanse the eyes. This was used as a trade good at times, especially in 1806. It was nearly invaluable and not something that gets discussed very often. The recipe of the eye wash was lead acetate. Also, white vitriol, or zinc sulfate, was used along with the lead acetate. At 3 p.m. on the 21st, they arrive at St. Charles. They saluted the residents with 3 volleys of rifle and blunderbuss fire. The rain delays them on the 22nd until 10 a.m. Then they set out. On the 23rd, Clark writes, took an early breakfast with Colonel Hunt and set out, descended to the Mississippi and down that river to St. Louis, at which place we arrived about 12 o'clock. They made it. John Ordway writes, about 12 o'clock we arrived in sight of St. Louis, fired 3 rounds as we approached the town and landed opposite the center of the town. The people gathered on shore and huzzaed 3 cheers. He ends the entry for the day, and this Ordway's final entry. We unloaded the canoes and carried the baggage all up to a storehouse in town. The party all considerably much rejoiced that we have the expedition completed, and now we look for boarding in town and wait for our settlement, and then we intend to return to our native homes to see our parents once more, as we have been gone so long from them. Finis. The 24th, Clark writes that both he and Lewis spent all day writing letters, correspondence. Of note is that he says Lewis opens his chest to retrieve his papers and finds them all wet, and some of the seeds were spoiled. Perhaps part of the missing Lewis journal entries can be attributed to degradation of the original papers that were in his chest and degraded. The evening of the 25th, Clark writes that there was a great dinner and a ball. They end the week back in St. Louis. Future podcasts through the end of 2017 will focus on epitaph-related topics when discussing 1806. In January 18, we will pick back up in 1806 events as they occur. That concludes this week's podcast. Join us again next week to hear all about what the Corps of Discovery are up to. There is a kind of magicness about going far away and then coming back all changed. Kate Douglas Wiggin. Thanks for listening.